And when I looked obsessively out of my window from 10 or 15 stories up, there they were, tiny figures huddled together against the cold.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. In mid-May, climate activist Bill McKibben had an op-ed in the New York Times called Obama's Catastrophic Climate Change Denial. He wrote it after Obama decided to let Shell Oil Company drill in the Arctic Ocean. McKibben wrote, "Even in this most extreme circumstance, no one seems to be able to stand up to the power of the fossil fuel industry. No one ever says no." By extreme, he meant the fact that oil spills in the Arctic would be incredibly more difficult to clean up than, let's say, the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which itself was difficult and very costly. But more than that, he meant that the idea that we are continuing to dig up fossil fuel, knowing that we have many more times the fuel already than it's safe to use, is an extreme, or should we say insane, folly. Last September, 400,000 people marched in New York City to demand an end to this insanity. Obviously, it didn't work. The pressure has to continue and increase. In Connecticut, there'll be a march on Sunday, May 31st in Hartford. Here's a promo from 350.org, or should I say 350connecticut.org.
Here in beautiful Connecticut, trying to ask you to help us preserve it. Come to Hartford on May 31st at noon. Meet at the Capitol for the CT Climate March. The march to tell our legislators that we want action on climate change. We want action now. We want action this year. So we can preserve the state that we love and the world that we love for generations to come. So please join us in Hartford, May 31st at noon, and be part of the solution to climate change. Thank you.
People will gather on the north side of Hartford's Capitol building for speeches and entertainment before the march. One of the speakers will be Hip Hop Caucus President Reverend Lennox Yearwood Jr. He's been a tireless advocate for connecting the dots between poverty, racism, violence, and environmental destruction. Here he is at a climate rally in D.C. several years ago. Just a few weeks ago, it was announced that carbon dioxide in the climate had for the first time gone over 400 parts per million worldwide for an entire month. 350 ppm is considered the upper limit to prevent dangerous global warming. Our only hope is protest. Here's one of cowboys and Indians last year, opposed to the Keystone XL pipeline, and another by Pacific Islanders trying to stop Newcastle, Australia, the biggest coal port in the world. We produce this show from Connecticut. Our fair state does its share to ruin the climate. We actually have a coal-burning power plant in Bridgeport. Harbor Station there only runs for part of the year, but is the single biggest producer of carbon dioxide in the state, last year producing over 900,000 tons of the greenhouse gas. These are a couple of pictures of a major protest in Massachusetts at its coal plant. Partly as a result of the protest, the plant is slated to close in 2017. The Hartford March is being sponsored by a whole host of groups, ranging from 350ct.org to the Connecticut Council for Environmental Justice and the Hartford Central Labor Council. As we record, over 400 indicated they were going on Facebook. And this is their Facebook page. To find it, search for Connecticut Climate March. That's CT Climate March. There's been a good deal of coverage about demonstrations by Israeli Jews of Ethiopian origin who are angry at the racism shown towards them and police brutality. They've had demonstrations, some of which were attacked violently. Color prejudice is another one of those things that is not told much about Israel, but it sure is there. And it really is the worst towards African refugees who are not Jews who try to get into Israel. They're slandered. They're all called infiltrators. And the government throws them out of the country as soon as it can, even though it has signed agreements about fair treatment of refugees. This video is from May 2nd, a rally in support of the refugee rights in Tel Aviv, courtesy of Israel Social TV.
תתביישו לכם לסייע לכל אותם מאות אלפי אנשים שהם גנבו את הגבול, הם לא פליטים, הם מסתננים. אנחנו מסכימים עם תושבי דרום תל אביב, מבקשי המקלט עצמם גם חושבים שאין שום סיבה שהם יהיו מרוכזים באזור כל כך קטן, באזור שהוחלש על ידי המדינה מאז היווסדה. המסר פשוט שלא ייתכן שנשלח אנשים שמוגנים תחת אמנת הפליט, על אף שמדינת ישראל לא בודקת את סטטוס הפליט שלהם, למדינות שמסכנות אותם.
אם יש הסכם בין ישראל ורואנדה שחייב להיות ארגוני זכויות אדם, חייב להיות מול האו"ם שיהיה הסכם ברור, ואחר מכן ברגע שיהיה הסכם ברור בין מדינת ישראל ומדינה שלישית אנחנו יכולים ללכת לשם.
יהודים, מפגינים, בעד הפליטים ואומרים די לגירוש, זה ממש מעמד חברתי חזק.
On May 12th, two young men went to a Westport synagogue and tried to read a statement of protest because the synagogue was hosting friends of the Israeli Defense Forces and an actual general from the Israeli army. Someone called a false 9/11 report to police saying there was a gun. Police came with sirens blaring, and the two men were arrested, schools were shut down, and so on. We hope to have video next week. For now, go to our website, thestruggle.org, to read about it. And of note, this ad campaign on the side of San Francisco buses. David Dellinger was a lifelong radical and pacifist. After the Chicago police riot in 1968, he was arrested and put on trial. He became known as one of the Chicago Eight. On the 11th anniversary of his passing, we show some video of Dellinger's 1997 talk at Yale. He had just published his book, From Yale to Jail.
So let me read this, and we'll see. The second winter after the 1929 stock market crash, my parents took my sister Lib and me to New York for a week of shows and sightseeing. I was 15 at the time. I really was 14. Well, book is full of errors. Can't believe it. We stayed at a fancy new hotel near Pennsylvania Station. Around the corner from the main entrance, there was a long line of men in shabby clothes, a bread line of people waiting for a free meal. The line stretched down the block and out of sight around a distant corner. For days, we never left or returned to the hotel without seeing these people. And when I looked obsessively out of my window from 10 or 15 stories up, there they were, tiny figures huddled together against the cold. The first chance I got, I walked down the block, looking at the faces of the men, wondering what it was like for them, wondering where they went after their hours of standing in line for a meager supper. I wondered why there weren't any children there, and only a few women. What happened to them? How did they get fed? Did the men bring home to them whatever they could slip into their pockets? Could it be true that the men and their families preferred this kind of life to working? I never forgot that bread line. But it wasn't until a few years later that I found out for sure whether most of them wanted to work or not, whatever I had thought and argued in the meantime. I found out by leaving Yale one afternoon in my oldest clothes and without any money, hitching rides and riding freight trains for a couple of weeks, staying at missions and in hobo jungles, standing in bread lines myself. It was an artificial attempt to get to know in a natural way some of the people who a lot of my Wakefield neighbors and Yale associates said were lazy. And it worked. My experiences on the road and the personal relationships I shared were less artificial than the privileged life I had been living. They broke the mold of the abstract and intellectual arguments I had been involved in. They had a profound effect on the rest of my life. I might not have gone on the road that time, except for some other things that happened in the years that followed my first unsettling glimpse of a bread line. The first of them occurred outside Dwight Hall during my freshman year. Inside, the graduate secretary was leading a small group of us in a discussion of what it meant to be a Christian in an unchristian world. Suddenly, we heard through the open window some excited shouts and the sounds of a policeman's whistle. We rushed to the window but could not see what was happening. A few minutes later, a late arrival informed us that a, quote, bum had collapsed on the campus and the university police had summoned an ambulance. The rest of the discussion ignored what had happened, but for some reason I brooded on it. Back in my room, trying to go to sleep, I couldn't get the incident out of my mind. Finally, I got up, dressed, went to the office of the campus police, and asked some questions. The man on duty was annoyed that a bum had slipped through their security precautions and gotten onto campus. Usually such people had to hang around on the streets just outside the university grounds if they wanted to solicit the students for funds. In the end, the officer told me which hospital he had called for the ambulance. By then it was after midnight, but I walked to the hospital. Who are you? Why do you want to know? Was he a relative? What business is it of yours? We're busy. Come back tomorrow during visiting hours. Eventually, I worked my way through to a sympathetic intern who told me that the man had died. Of malnutrition, he said. I asked some more questions, and finally, after looking me up and down and obviously taking in my Yale clothes and Yale look, he said in the manner of an older, wiser brother, "If you really want to know, he died of starvation." Had he been drinking? There were no signs of alcohol at all. I asked this question because the conventional wisdom at Yale was, don't give them money, they'll just spend it on liquor. From then on, still nervous about liquor, but anxious to help some of those whose plight had been brought home to me, and wishing both to establish human contact and to learn more, I ate more meals than I otherwise would have in the nearest off-campus cafeteria. I'm just on my way to get a bite myself, I used to say. Would you like to join me? So they had to pay for their meal by submitting themselves to my questions and conversation, though I tried to be sensitive to their pride and to act as a friend rather than an interrogator. Now, I'm going to skip a couple of pages where I give another incident that prompted me, and then I'll continue. Leaving Yale, dressed in my oldest clothes and carrying no money, I walked to the outskirts of town. On the way, I talked with a hobo who was hanging out on a street corner. He didn't seem to think it was odd for me to be on the road. That made me feel better, since I was pretty self-conscious, worried that I might be spotted as a slumming Yalie. He told me that everything filled up early and I'd better head for the Yale Hope Mission, or I might end up stranded for the night in the bitter cold. The grub's not bad there, he said, but they'll only let you stay one night unless you get saved. If you do, you can stay 2 nights. Sometimes 3, and then you have to move on. I told him I had to make tracks. I didn't want to go to the Yale Hope Mission for other reasons. And he told me that the next place for a free lodging was Bridgeport at the Sally, which is short for Salvation Army, but that I didn't have a lot of time before they closed their doors. As we talked, he shared a roll your own with me, and I felt that I was beginning to experience the comradeship of the road. I got a couple of rides fairly soon and managed to get to Bridgeport and find the Sally in time to get admitted. The man at the desk asked me for my name and address and where I had stayed the previous night. For reasons it is hard to explain, this was my first crisis. Probably it shouldn't have been hard for me to give a fictitious name and address, but for some reason I couldn't bring myself to do it. Don't ask me all the considerations that went into my reaction, but after stumbling around for a while, I gave my correct name and my home address in Massachusetts. At the man's request, I gave my father's name as well. I was so scared that the words practically stuck in my throat. He had to ask 2 or 3 times before he could hear them. I was particularly scared that he would call my father on the phone. Or if he didn't call him, he would routinely send the information to the Wakefield police, and my parents would be humiliated by a visit from them. But as I remembered, I'd begun by deciding that I couldn't say I came from Yale and had stayed there last night, or I would get the kind of attention I didn't want. Perhaps he would throw me out. Suddenly I was in deeper than I had expected, particularly after he asked for my father's name. At that point, I think I decided that if worse came to worst, it might be good for my father to know that I was on the road and why. In all our arguments about the Depression and the sufferings of the poor, he argued that I didn't know what life was really like. All my ideas came from books, he would say. Now I was trying to find out firsthand a little of what life was like for some of the people we had argued about. Although I hated for my father to be embarrassed and hoped that the man wouldn't contact him, I was in a sense doing something my father ought to appreciate in the end. The man seemed to sense my embarrassment and very gently told me to sit in the waiting room, which was just outside the office and in full view of it. It would be a while, he said, until time for the service, followed by supper and bed. But already the benches were nearly filled. After a while, I saw the man at the desk talking on the phone, and shortly afterwards he called my name and motioned for me to come back into the office. My heart sank, thinking that he had called my father. "Those men are pretty rough," he said. "I can see that you're different, so you'd better be careful, particularly when you go upstairs tonight. For now, you can wait in this little room behind my office." My heart sank, but not for the reason I had originally feared, and not because of his fears for my safety, which I appreciated but didn't share. I thanked him but told him I'd be all right and turned down the offer. I didn't want to be treated differently than the others, as all my life I had been treated differently than poor people. After 24 hours on the road, nobody ever suggested that I looked any different or was any different than the rest of the vagrants. In fact, one of my vivid memories comes from early in my travels when I was treated first with ridicule and then with scorn as a bum. I was in New York Central Park and exhausted, having walked for miles after having been let off in the Bronx by a truck driver. In return for the ride, I had helped him unload his heavy cargo before making the long trek to mid-Manhattan. I hadn't eaten since supper at a mission the night before, the standard one-meal-a-day routine that I soon became accustomed to. My head was swimming and I itched all over, either from lice or bedbug bites, or both. I rested for a while on a park bench, dozed off, woke up enough to stretch out full length, and fell sound asleep. I woke to the sounds of two children who were jumping down in front of the bench and pointing at me. "Look, Mummy, look at the funny man." "Get away from him. Come here at once. It's a bum. I told you to stay away from them." It probably doesn't sound like much, but it was the low point of my trip. "Suffer the little children to come to me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." But what if you have become so ugly and confused that you scare them away? If I had felt right inside, I probably wouldn't have minded looking unattractive on the outside, even to little children. But before I fell asleep and when I woke up, I hadn't been able to figure out what I was doing there or why. All my good intentions and all the benefits I had looked forward to and even experienced had dissipated. My flesh was weak, and so was my spirit. I sat there for a long time, getting hold of myself, thinking of what I had already learned from the comradeship of the men I had hung out with in the missions and on the streets. I reflected on their courage and fortitude in the face of adversities they had not chosen and which they could not leave behind by hitchhiking back to Yale. My headache didn't leave me, and I felt dizzy when I stood up and tried to walk, but gradually my spirit recovered. At last, I was ready to make a move. I decided that the only realistic thing to do was to ask a passerby for a few cents to buy some food. First, though, I staggered over to the nearby Central Park Zoo to gain some strength from the animals. Before I realized what was happening, someone approached me with an offer of help. He was a well-dressed man in a business suit, and he started a conversation with me. After a few preliminaries, he asked me if I was hungry. When I said, sort of, he invited me to go to his place, where there was plenty of food and drink, and putting his hand on my shoulder where we could have some fun. After wrestling with the matter a moment, I decided that it wouldn't be fair to accept his invitation, partake of his food, and then tell him that I wasn't open to that kind of fun. So I thanked him and moved to the next cage. Asking for money was one of the hardest things I ever did in my life. In part, I did it because I saw no alternative. I didn't think that in my current condition I could make it downtown to the Bowery, where the missions and the municipal lodging house were. But there was another element as well. For years I had been infatuated with Christian communism, the early disciples' way of life, in which, as I understood it, everyone shared their worldly goods, and no one was allowed to go hungry or suffer other privations that could be remedied through sharing. Up to a point, I had tried my best to live that way. But of course, I had never succeeded.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.
When the world has gone crazy and it's all becoming clear, when they're gunning down our comrades and it seems the end is near, as they're loading up the launchers for the tear gas grenades, we can take off our bandanas and kiss behind the barricades. When it's madness all around and you can see this at a glance, we will sing and we will cry, we will laugh and we will dance, as they shout their marching orders beneath the helicopter blades. We shall seize the moment for a kiss behind the barricades. They will try to break our spirit, and at times they may succeed, but our love for the world is stronger than their greed. When the building is surrounded and hope begins to fade, in my final hour, a kiss behind the barricades. As the movement grows, there will be hills and bends, but at the center of the struggle are your lovers and your friends. And the more we hold each other up, the less we can be swayed. Here's to love and solidarity, and a kiss behind the barricades.